I'm the founder of Continuon, and I just want to give a bit of background on Continuon and obviously why we've conducted this analysis to give a bit of context before we go into the findings of all the research that we've done. So Continuon was really formed because we believe that there are two major things happening in marketing and digital marketing as a whole in the world. Obviously, there's a huge breakdown of trust between brands, media, government, and humans. Let's put it that way. And secondly, digital has forever disrupted the way the world engages with brands. It's become a noisy place. There are so many channels. And really, as brands, what we've done is we've just used those to broadcast back to people. So really what we're seeing is a fundamental breakdown in trust between brands and people. And we believe that using data, and particularly social data in this instance, we can start forging better connections between brands and people by truly understanding people's behavior, understanding their interests. And as marketers and advertisers and businesses, we've been masters of our own demise. We've abused that relationship in the past. When people have passed a piece of data or personal information onto us, we've sent them spam, we've sold it, etc. So really what we're trying to do is make marketing authentic again. In this case, we're looking at social data and influencership. And I think a lot of people in the audience will probably define or think of influencers as celebrities, online influencers like Logan Paul, or Paul Logan, I always get his name, I always get it the wrong way around. And micro influencers who have got smaller audiences but a really strong niche. But what we're really looking at is we're looking at what we're calling brand influencers. And brand influencers are people within a brand social media community that carry influence within that particular brand's community. These people don't know that they're influential. They don't want to be influencers. They don't want to be paid for putting out product or brand posts. They just engage with the brand because they truly have a strong affinity towards it or are advocates of it. So that's really something that you need to keep in mind this evening when we're going through all this research and all the findings, is that we're talking about ordinary people that carry influence within a particular brand's social media community. So that's enough of a plug about Continuon, otherwise Fred's going to kick me off the stage. So why did we do this study? Well, firstly, let's talk a little bit about the study. The study is done, or the analysis is done, 50 brands participated, 50 major or really well-recognized brands in South Africa participated. We analyzed over 100 million data points across 3 of the biggest social networks, which are Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, across 9 different categories. So that's a little bit about the sort of size of the analysis that was done. The reason we did it was because we wanted to sort of start getting a cross-section across categories about the quality of influence within brands and particularly within categories themselves. And that is really why we are here this evening. So I'm going to move on to some of the findings. And bear in mind that this is last night we presented this in Joburg. It got a little bit technical, so we're going to take the learnings from last night and hopefully keep it nice and interesting. But bear in mind there will be a Q&A right at the end of the session. And you're welcome to obviously talk to myself or any of our team members who are here this evening, should you have any further questions. I also just wanted to say thank you to Worldwide Works and Arthur for partnering with us on this analysis, to Heavy Chef for obviously giving us a platform to provide the results or to release the results. And obviously our team at Continuon, who have been pretty much burning the midnight oil for 3 months, keeping servers running and doing a whole bunch of stuff. So without further ado, let's move on to some of the findings. So as I mentioned earlier, these are some of the stats that we're looking at. 100 million plus data points. we identified 5.25 million unique engagers across 50 brands. Now, I just want you to think about that number for a second. We're only looking at 50 brands, and South Africa's got a population of about 60 million people. That's almost 10% of people that have engaged with these brands in the social media space during the last 3 months. It's quite major in my mind. Also, when we talk, off the back of that, we've got 355,000 unique influencers that we've identified. So I'll get into a little bit more around the definition of all of this to give you a context in the next slide. But it's a really, really big piece of analysis. That's what we're trying to get across here. If we go into a bit of a glossary before we start the actual data, is those of you who run social media pages will know you've got fans and followers. Those are people who like your page or follow your account. We've got engagers. Now this is a very, very important point. People who have engaged with content or a piece of content that a brand puts out on a social platform may not necessarily be a fan or a follower. For those of you who are in the industry, you'll know that we're now using engagement as a metric, and Facebook and all the big social media companies are making us pay for engagement. Often we target audiences that aren't sitting inside our brand page communities, within our fans and followers. So those are defined as engagers. So often you may have more engagers than you would fans or followers. And then we've got influencers. And influencers are basically people that our algorithm has identified who carry velocity of conversation within a brand community. And that's something I really want to focus on just for a split second, is the metrics that we typically use as marketers, we believe are really fluffy, are skewed. We tend to talk about reach. We tend to, those of you who use paid influencer strategies will tend to go, how many followers does this person have? And that's what we define as successful. Someone's got 100,000 followers, therefore they've got clout, they've got reach. What we're saying is there should be other metrics outside of reach that should come into play. And those two metrics we believe are relevance and resonance. Resonance is the ability to drive someone into action. If you think about true influence, like not online, let's take a step back, not online influence, real world influence. It comes down to who do you trust, and the people you trust are, friends and family and those closest to you that drive word of mouth. If someone recommends a product to you that you trust, if a friend recommends, I'm a whiskey drinker, so a whiskey to you, and you trust that person, you'll go buy it. You won't ask that person, how many friends do you have? So why do we use those metrics when it comes to marketing? It often boggles our mind. So resonance is really the ability to drive something into action and drive a action from someone. And relevance is obviously how relevant you are within your circle or sphere of influence. So I just want you to bear that in mind. So when we look at influencers and we talk about velocity of conversation, we're talking about resonance. When I engage with a piece of content that a brand has put out, how much resonance does that carry? And I'll get a bit more into that just now. But anyway, so as you can see, our algorithm scores that from 0 to out of 100. Very, very rare that you ever find anyone with 100. And then you can see the sort of 9 categories that we've looked at: beverages, financial services, all the way down to retail. We've looked at 17 large brands, 20 medium-sized brands, and 13 small brands. And then this section in the middle here, that is Continuon's way of how we sort of put influencers into brackets. So anyone with a score of 0 to 20 is called the herd. Hopefully that's not too derogatory, but that's what we call them. Then we've got sharers, who are slightly more influential. Obviously trendsetters, lighthouse, and icons are like they're really influential within your brand community. And obviously what you would find is that the shape of these communities would tend to look like, or we would think would tend to look like pyramids. So heavy herd bases and very, very small icon bases at the top. So I'm going to move on now quickly onto the velocity of conversation slide, because this came up a lot last night and we didn't have this slide in last night's presentation, so we decided to add it because a lot of people are going, well, what is velocity of conversation? So if you look at this is a really simple illustration of it. A brand puts out a piece of content. You can see interactions start to happen, or engagement starts to happen with a piece of content. And then at that bottom point there, someone, let's call that point A, they engage with a piece of content, and all of a sudden that content gains a lot of traction. Not reach, because we're talking about number of interactions with a person, not how much reach a piece of content is getting. Then at point B, someone else engages with that piece of content, but they don't really have a lot of influence within this brand's community. So you can see the post sort of plateaus again, or the piece of content sort of plateaus again, and then all of a sudden person number C engages with a piece of content, and once again it starts gaining more and more engagement. So I hope this sort of explains that. What we also take into account is how popular a piece of content is or not. So if someone engages with a piece of content and it gets, let's say, 400 engagements or 400 interactions, of which they were responsible for 300, you would think that they were pretty influential. But if posts in general or content in general across a brand's page tends to get thousands of interactions, then really they're not influential. They were only influential on that one piece of content. So we also look at what is popular and what is not popular. Okay, now I'm going to go into some findings. I hope your brains are all still with me here at this point in time. So the findings, let's get into some of them. So the first thing is, let's take a little bit of a myth buster here. Fans and followers aren't everything. I think a lot of marketers already know that, or a lot of digital marketers already know that. We start looking at engagement as opposed to fans and followers. But this really starts looking at it down on a per category basis. And what you can start seeing is that engagers, you'll recall, as I said earlier, is anyone that is engaged with a piece of content. They may not necessarily be part of your, or like your page or follow your account, but they've engaged with your content. We start looking at a ratio of engagers to fans and followers. And what you start seeing is that some categories tend to perform better than others. If you look at beverages, disclaimer, there were quite a few alcoholic beverages in there, which is probably why so many people tend to engage. So they've got a ratio of 121%, which means that basically they've got more people that engage with their content than actually follow their pages or accounts. If you look at someone like non-profit, you would think, yes, it's pretty not great. They've only got 7%. But this is only telling one story. Because what we want to start looking at down the line is what is the quality of that engagement, and that's really where influence starts to come into play. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to show you some of the top performers within those categories. So despite, so you can see, so the average I think in beverages was 121%. But if you look at it here, the best performing brand, and just a bit of a disclaimer, we're not here to give brand data. It's their intellectual property. So this, we're not naming the brand, we're just saying who performed best. They had a ratio of 248%. Then you had some retail clothing, their best was 186. And as you can see, it goes all the way down to financial services, which kind of makes sense that not many people want to engage with their financial services guys unless they're complaining, I guess. But engagement doesn't equal influence either. So this is also, now we're sort of layering it on, putting another layer on top, is that this starts to look at how a ratio of influencers to engagers. So just because you've engaged with a piece of content, just because people engage with content doesn't make them influential, doesn't make them carry velocity of conversation within your brand. And that's where we start getting a very different picture here compared to the one that we did when we looked at just engagement. If you'll recall, beverages was flying quite high in terms of engagers versus fans and followers. But if you look at the amount of influencers as a ratio to how many engagers they've got in their brands, all of a sudden they've slipped down into fourth place, and media is in number 1 now. So media as a ratio of influences to engagers is now number 1. Fred, are you still with me?
Yeah, I'm getting
Are we getting there?
It takes a while, but I'm here.
It's complex stuff, sorry guys, when you try to get through this, but stay with us if you can. I think the 3 layers to sort of think about, just keep in your mind here, is that fans and followers are probably like the weakest metric. Engagement is a stronger metric, but just because you have a lot of engagers doesn't mean you have a lot of influencers, and just because you have a lot of influencers doesn't mean that those influencers are good. So just keep that story in mind the whole way through. So yeah, you can start seeing things start to change quite a bit here. Fast food has got still a huge amount of engagers, but their ratio of influencers to engagers isn't that great. Now we're going to start looking at something quite interesting. If you recall the glossary that I put up right at the beginning, you'll remember our tiers. And now we start looking at the shape of influence per category. So what this actually looks at is per category, on average, how many influences were there in each of those buckets that we had up front, sort of 0 to 20, 21 to 40, etc. And what you can start finding here straight away is that what really sticks out here for me is non-profit. So as I said earlier, non-profit had a small percentage of influences to engagers, but if you look at the quality of those influences, it's really, really high. If you look at the shape of their community or the shape of their influences compared to some of the other categories, it's really strong. And I think that illustrates quite a powerful point in that non-profit, when people engage with non-profit causes, well, that's really the word there, it's a cause. It tends to be authentic, right? They're not engaging with a brand that may not be, they're not going out to win a competition, let's put it that way. They actually truly believe in what they're engaging with. And I think that's really why the shape of non-profit influences is so great. I mean, some of the others perform really well, but as sort of expected, we've got sort of these pyramid shapes, some better than others. Retail, non-clothing, slightly better than obviously health and wellness, not doing great there. Beverages has got quite a big bottom base, but no real icons. But the 2 key points I want to put out here is authenticity, which comes down to like causes, and obviously that very, very few brands have got, or very, very few categories have got a lot of icons. Bear in mind, we haven't gone into many decimal places here. There are icons, but overall, as a percentage, they're very, very few. If we go into the top performers, which is the individual brand that performed best in each of these categories, we start to see certain things. All of a sudden, the top performer in beverages, their shape is quite different. So if I just want to flick back here quickly. Can you see that? I mean, it's really quite good. And also media starts to show a bit of a different trend there. Fast food, retail clothing. So what we're trying to illustrate here is that even though a category may not have a great shape of influence, there are certain brands within those categories that can have a great shape of influence. And what does that really tell us? That tells us that, like everything in marketing, digital, business, it really boils down to strategy. These top performers tend to have much better strategies to engage their audiences and attract quality influences within their brand communities than other brands do. The next slide is an interesting one. This looks at social channels. So which social channels across all these categories have got the largest audience, the largest engagers, and the most amount of influencers. And this is a very one-dimensional slide, but we put it in here on purpose. Most brands' audiences, or the largest audiences that they have, are on Facebook. It's as simple as that. Most brands' largest amounts of fans and followers sit on Facebook, and therefore, by virtue of the numbers, they've got the most engagers on Facebook. And outside of sort of 2 categories, therefore, by virtue, most of their influencers are on Facebook. But if you take this on a weighted view, so a like-for-like view, things look very different. So although you may have if you look at this on a one-for-one, so if we had to bring all of the numbers down and weight them, all of a sudden Instagram is becoming the winner here in terms of influencers. You may have less followers on Instagram, but you've got way more, relatively speaking, you've got more engagers and more influencers. And I think that's a really important point in that we do think, I think a lot of us do think of Instagram as an influencer platform, but this really drives it home. And a lot of people also think Twitter is a great influencer platform, but from our analysis, it looks like it's not really doing a great job at the moment. The next thing I wanted to look at quickly is shape. So we looked at shape of influence by category. Now I'm going to take you through shape of influence by brand size. So small, medium, and large. And I think very quickly here, the one thing that I wanted to point out, if you look at it very quickly, small and medium brands are the only ones that have got icons. Now that could be a function of a whole bunch of things, or a whole bunch of variables, which we won't go into now. But what we want to illustrate here is that just because you're a small brand doesn't mean that you can't be doing a good job in social media. I think, Facebook, all the social media platforms, it was a great business strategy. They pulled a nice bait and switch, come grow your audiences with us, attract a whole bunch of people, and now all of a sudden we're going to make you pay to reach those people. So I think as marketers we believe that social has become a pay-to-play space, which it has, and it's right. But that's not to say that small brands can't compete or do a really great job when it comes down to true, authentic influence or velocity of conversation within their communities. And I think that's really what we're trying to show here. Once again, just showing how the top performers, according to each brand size, performed. And as you can see, the same sort of thing, as the same sort of point as I made with categories. Just because a particular brand size or a particular category may not have a great shape of influence doesn't mean that you as a brand within that category can't be doing a good job. We're almost at the end, guys. I thank you for your attention. I know this is a lot of information. This is just a quick snapshot of the top individual influencers per category. So we're talking about specific people within a particular brand that have got the highest score according to our algorithms per category. And as you can see, once again, non-profit sticks out, 90.9. That is the highest score we've ever seen. And once again, it boils down to authenticity. Health and wellness, not doing great there. Retail, clothing, fashion, doing pretty well. But another point I'd like to point out here, that engagement doesn't necessarily equal influence. So the person who's got the highest score of influence or the highest propensity to drive velocity of conversation has 188 engagements, whereas the person with the lowest score has got 557 engagements. And what we actually found is that engaging with a brand, you can have millions of people engaging with your brand, but that doesn't actually mean that they're influential within your specific brand community. So I just wanted to get that point across. So really, what does all of this mean, I think, for you? I think now we're going to get to stuff that actually you can take home or back to the office. I don't know, do Cape Townians work on a Friday? I'm not sure. Anyway, on Monday you can take it back to the office. So, guys, I'm from Cape Town, so it's a joke either way. But anyway, I think the first thing we want to say is we need a new vocabulary for influence. Reach is dead. And I'm not saying reach is dead. Reach is still a very important metric. Reach, as we define it, is dead. So the definition of reach at the moment is fans and followers or eyeballs, in my opinion at least. I mean, yes, guys go into impressions and all those type of things. What we're saying is quality reach is still important. So by quality reach, I mean if 300 people, if I engage with a piece of content and 300 other people see that's what traditional reach would be considered. What we're saying is if I engage with a piece of content and 300 people see it and 299 engage with it, that is quality reach. So it's a combination of both. Resonance and relevance, as I mentioned earlier, are the new currency. They're the things that we should be looking at and trying to measure. Velocity of a conversation is the fuel in all of this. If I may not have a lot of friends and followers, which I don't, but it doesn't mean that I can't carry influence. And then we're really just scraping the surface here. I mean, new measures are going to continually emerge. I mean, we're only looking at sort of social data here. When we start tying in other data sources, you know, from CRM to purchase behavior to all those sorts of things, we can really start getting a very, very deep understanding of people. And we can start understanding how to change behavior, because that's really what influence is about. It's about changing people's behavior. So, some key takeouts. As I said before, there's more to influence than reach and fans and followers. Brands have thousands of authentic brand influencers in their own social media communities that they could and should be leveraging. So I'm not saying that don't use celebrities, don't use micro-influencers, don't use influencers. I'm saying you have a wealth of authentic influencers in your social media communities right now that you could be tapping into. Outside of paid influencers, I think an influencer strategy needs to encompass all of these things, but I think we've neglected to sort of realize that there are people within our own brand communities that have influence. Engagement is important, as I mentioned, but it doesn't always equal influence. However, all categories have people that do engage heavily with content, and that shouldn't be ignored, as we know. There is considerable variation across categories with regards to overall influence scores and the number of authentic influencers. That is less of an indication of how the categories perform in social and more of a sign that strategy still reigns supreme. So that goes back to my point around brands and categories, and although the category may not perform very well, you as a brand can still perform very well within that category. Two more. As I mentioned before, social is now considered a pay-to-play space. The biggest budget wins. That's not necessarily true. Money does always help, but as a small brand, even in an unsexy category, you can still be doing a great job. And as I mentioned earlier, social data is just the first layer of influence that we're starting to analyze to understand people better. So I know this was a hell of a lot to take in. We are going to make these findings available on our website. We are around to chat. There will be a Q&A at the end. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I know it's been probably one of the more rigorous sessions that we've had at Heavy Chef. And lastly, I'd just like to thank all the brands that also trusted us with their data and actually decided to participate. It's a huge vote of confidence, and we wouldn't be able to have done this without you. So thank you, everyone.